Welcome everyone to our third and final webinar as we work our way up to the day of doom, as I call it, the conference next week, May 11th through the 13th. I'm going to introduce here in a moment Joshua Cutchin, and then engage Joshua in a conversation. Just a couple notes, logistic notes. First of all, for the guests, please ask your questions in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Also, I will use your name unless you tell me otherwise. If you don't want me to use your name, of course, I won't do it, but you need to tell me that in the question. Joshua and I will talk for about a half hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A and engage the audience as best we can. Okay. Also, I hope it goes without saying that Joshua will be with us at the conference next week here in Houston, Texas at Rice University. So please, if you're coming, feel free to stop and talk to Joshua as well. All right. Joshua Cutchin, let me just say a few words about him and then bring him into this conversation. Joshua lives in Georgia. He's a native of North Carolina. He is a musician, professional musician, plays the tuba in jazz and classical music, and is the author of 7 books. I hear there's another one, maybe 2 more coming out. I was first introduced to Joshua by a friend named Eric Wargo, a book called A Trojan Feast, which is a wild and wonderful book. I immediately recognized what I would call pure originality. The subtitle of this book, I think, says it all: the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. Nobody writes like that. Nobody writes about that except Joshua Cutchin. His next book, even more so, The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. Again, the whole question of smells, paranormal smells. Then yet another book came quickly after called Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions. And then a 2-volume study of Bigfoot and the paranormal dimensions of the Bigfoot legends called Where the Footprints End. And then not last, we'll talk more about others, but the three volumes that most caught my eye and certainly my heart: Ecology of Souls, a new mythology of death and the paranormal, which really, to kind of give it a quick summary, links the UFO and the nature of the soul. So anyway, welcome Joshua to our third and final webinar. You're it. You're the summary as we move into this next week.
Hot potato.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kripal. It's an absolute honor to be here, and that was an excellent summation of everything that I've done so far. So kudos on that.
You're wildly original. I mean, that's what I would say about your books, is they don't follow the usual paths that a lot of books follow. The footprints don't hand to misquote you. I mean, you walk down a lot of to a lot of forests that I've certainly never been.
Well, I had a saying once, and I suppose it bears repeating, that this field needs another book about something like Roswell, like a submarine needs a screen door, right? I mean, it's just so many of these narratives have just been done to death, and even when the waters aren't too murky to make sense of what's in there, I suspect that approaching these things from a little bit more of a novel angle might stand to shed a little bit more light on it than just sort of approaching it directly all the time. My mentor, Gregory Bishop, who's a mutual friend of ours, often talks about addressing things obliquely, and so that's been a big influence on myself. But a lot of my guiding force in what I've been doing is to take a look at some of the literature that's out there, and see where somebody, mentions an observation in a sentence. And that when that sentence appears in multiple forms across different authors, but nobody ever sort of unpacks it, I say, well, this is a great thing to sort of take a look at. So the exchange of food and drink was one of those. The types of odors that are noticed in these numinous encounters is certainly something that people, observe time and again. Boy, these UFOs seem to smell like sulfur. Something about demons. Anyway, moving on to the next case. And so it just seemed to me like there might be more ramifications within each of those little tidbits than was being really appreciated. So I suppose that my guiding ethos has sort of become one of trying to understand more about these phenomena through the tiny details than rather necessarily taking a big holistic picture. Because, I realize that the saucer era didn't necessarily start in 47 as some people claim, but let's say that it did. 70 some odd years later, like it doesn't seem like we're especially closer to finding out quote unquote truths than we have been in a while. So so maybe if we again approach these topics in a little bit more of an indirect way, we might actually learn something at the end of the day.
You use this adjective. I think it's very appropriate. You call yourself a Fortean, you know, in the lineage of Charles Fort, who, one of my heroes and one of the great comparativists of the 20th century, who nobody in this comparative study of religion or culture or anything else ever reads or would even remotely want to own. But he had he had a different quirky, humorous style than you do, but his focus on these details that don't quite fit in to any of our orders of knowledge does remind me a lot of what you do in the books.
Today being the anniversary of Charles Fort's passing, actually.
Really?
91 years, I think. Yeah, I was looking at something else today and I said, oh, it's May 3rd. That's today.
So I'm going to make a confession here online. I don't know if I've ever said this, but I've only sought out one gravestone in my entire life. I have never visited a person's grave except Charles Fort. And I went up to Albany and made a pilgrimage to the Fort family graveyard. And I heard from Fortians, after some of my earlier books, and I didn't actually know a lot about him until later. So I think he's one of our unsung heroes in all of this.
I would agree with that, and it's part of the reason that I've personally taken up the Fortean mantle with such enthusiasm, because for me it's not just a subject matter, right? It's not just the phenomenology of these experiences. It's also sort of an attitude and a disposition as well. If you really follow in those true Fortean footsteps, you do measure a circle from anywhere, and you do pick up a history from its frogs, and you just survey things with, I wouldn't necessarily call it a certain agnosticism, but it's a certain, I think, detachment when you sort of take a look at these damned facts. And I have a confession to make, which is that when I first wrote A Trojan Feast, it being my first foray into this topic, I'm like, oh man, do I have to vet every single case? And I really sort of fretted over that. And I came to the conclusion that once you approach things from that sort of almost Fortean perspective, you can just say, look, this is the story. And I don't know if it's true, and I don't know necessarily the credibility of these witnesses or whatnot, but here are 17 other stories that look the same way. Fort said something similar about slowly falling rocks in poltergeist cases, right? So it's proved to be a guiding light for me along this path as I've gone deeper and deeper and continued to ruin my reputation amongst friends and family.
Yeah, the other way I put that is humor. When you read Charles Fort, you laugh a lot. At least I laugh a lot. And I mean, there's lines like, he'll be talking about finding a dragon or a sea monster on a beach, and then he'll just write this one line. He'll say something like, well, that's a bit too much.
A little too interesting or something.
Yeah, that's just too much. I'm going to go on. And then he just goes on and he doesn't explain it. He doesn't defend it. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, oh, wow, that's a different attitude right there than this more uptight one that I think we're used to. So,
It does, it does seem to be there seems to be a tension matching our times all around some of these topics nowadays. So yeah, I always find it to be a breath of fresh air.
so let me ask, okay, so let's dig down a little. Let's learn about Joshua Cutchin. I'm sure you've done a lot of these interviews, but maybe not. I don't know. Let's talk about how you got into this crazy mess and how you came to write these books, the books that you have written, have published. I mean, tell us the backstory of this and how we can think about this.
Well, I grew up in a household where these topics were never taboo. I remember learning years later when people would say, you're not supposed to believe in ghosts, or ghosts aren't real, or something like that. And I was like, this has never been something that's been discouraged in my family. To the contrary, I found out once I started actually writing about these topics that my father, in his younger days, had actually subscribed to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization newsletter back when it was still a paper newsletter sent through the post. So there was always sort of a willingness to entertain these topics, and I would check out books from the library and read about these different things. And my parents' attitude, which I think is quite a healthy one, is, oh well, the boy's reading, right? At least he's reading. So I always had an interest for these things. I've got, actually, funny enough, it's sitting right here. This is my copy of Jerry Clark's The Unexplained that I read in middle school, and you'll notice that it's been covered in clear packing tape by my mom some years ago, because the cover literally fell off. So I always had an interest in this. I had a small library of a couple of things. Really wasn't interested in the UFO topic that much, to be honest with you. Then in 2012, I got a desk job at the University of Georgia working as public affairs director in the School of Music, and I had an hour commute there and an hour commute back. And that was sort of, it's still a bit the wild west of podcasts, and there are more than ever, but that was when, that was when the paranormal podcast machine really hit into overdrive, and I rediscovered some of these interests and some of these loves that I had for so long. This just so happened to coincide a year or two later with an Amazon gift card that my sister-in-law had given me. And I said, you know what, I'm going to buy myself an Unexplained Mysteries book. I hadn't indulged that side of myself in a while. And I picked up a copy of J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch, and I was reading through it. And it's a fantastic book. It approaches Bigfoot from a flesh and blood angle, but also is very respectful of indigenous traditions. And in one of the chapters, it mentions that one of the Bigfoot analogs amongst one of the tribes along the southwestern coast of the southern coast of Alaska, their Bigfoot analog is known as the Bequest. And if you take food from the Bequest, you're trapped with the Bequest forever. And I said, that rings a bell, because, I'd always picked up little bits and bobs here and there of Fortean ephemera. And one of the things that I picked up was that Western European food taboo, that if you took food from the good folk, when you were in their realm, you would be trapped there forever. And I said to myself, why does this tribe, with no supposed cultural contaminations, share this belief from Western Europe? And I sort of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with that, and rediscovered the Persephone myth, which I'm sure I was tangentially familiar with, but really got into it. But the diaspora of that myth throughout Eurasia, and even if you're being generous, Africa, doesn't explain that same food taboo appearing up in New Zealand and Australia, and certainly not in the New World. I think it really paints you into one of three possibilities. Either A, there was some sort of global civilization that was transmitting these myths at a level that we don't appreciate. B, the collective unconscious actually is a thing. Or C, lo and behold, perish the thought, these interactions actually have some sort of basis in objective reality, which is obviously the one that I'm most partial to, although I think option B is quite interesting as well. And I sat on that for a while, saying, oh, you eat food from Bigfoot and you're trapped with Bigfoot, and you eat food with fairies and you're trapped with fairies. Somebody should write a book on that. And I sort of waited for a while until I said to myself, oh, I guess that person might be me. And that's a big step, to I'm not saying this in a way of bragging, but I'm saying this in terms of like the decision to
It would be this
kind of,
book.
yes, sir, yes, sir. The decision to kind of come out publicly about being interested in these topics is kind of a dicey proposition, and it just so happened to coincide with me looking to move to a different position. I was applying to several different jobs, and I'm pretty sure that I got through several rounds of job interviews before they decided to Google to Google me, and then a Trojan feast pops up. So I became eminently unemployable at that point, and I said, well, I'm just going to do music and writing. And that was in 2015. And it's just been more books and more playing and teaching music ever since. And it's a decision that I wish I'd made a long time ago, but it was definitely one that I understand why I didn't jump into that chasm any sooner than I did.
You know, well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Here's another question that occurs to me, just listening to your story. You know, we share some mutual friends, Greg Bishop, and David Metcalf, actually. And you and David, in particular, live in a particular part of the country that fascinates me. And I'm wondering if it has inflected at all your interest in the paranormal or the impossible. And by that, I mean, of course, the American kind of Southeast. You're in Georgia now, and you're a native of North Carolina, but you're in a part of the country where this kind of folk belief, I think, is much more prominent and active, frankly, than it probably is in the Northeast or parts where where I grew up. I grew up in the Midwest. Is there anything there, or am I just projecting? I'm just like
No,
making stuff up.
I'm not sure that it's influenced me, but it's definitely here. I mean, there's that sort of poetic resonance of the Highlands and the Appalachian Mountains being basically one and the same, and how a lot of those older traditions didn't really die. They just sort of metamorphosed when they came over here with the people, that live in the mountains to this day. You've got the robust indigenous traditions here. I mean, I live 30 minutes away from the Etowah Mounds, which are just a fantastic site to go to, and which in my current thinking I have trouble distinguishing the North American mounds in form or function from some of these old world monuments now. Don't worry, folks, this isn't like some sort of master race thing. It's a completely different topic. I explain it in the book, but what I'm trying to get at is these are places of power that have their own certain numinous quality attached to them. Then you have the robust traditions that came over here with people of African descent, and how they sort of have diffused and mixed in a lot of ways with a lot of the rural white beliefs. And the other thing that just sort of boggles my mind, people think of Bigfoot being a West Coast phenomenon, but the Appalachian Mountains just up here in Blue Ridge is a Bigfoot hotspot. And there's actually a Bigfoot museum up there, and it was David Metcalf who had the lovely observation when he and I went. We've been there twice together, and David made the observation that as the owner of the museum was sharing all the different reports that he's collected in the years since putting it in the museum, David said it's almost like a temple to Bigfoot was built and started attracting more activity. And I'm like, that's such a David thing to say, but I think he's right on. I think he's right on with that. So,
Yeah. Let's talk about Ecology of Souls. Okay. I know we've talked about this before, but this comparison between the UFO and the soul, or the UFO and the NDE, as I like to say, is something that I would say serious researchers know about. I would say that this is one of the things you run into, pretty far down the road. And I think it kind of boggles the mind. It sort of breaks people's categories. But it's obviously there. And, I'm sort of like you. I'm like, somebody should write a book about that. And then I'm like, oh, Joshua Cutchin wrote a book about it. I guess we don't need to do that anymore. But you didn't write one book about it. 3 volumes, Joshua. I mean, you went
Yeah, you left it to me
overboard
to
on
be
the thing.
foolish enough. You left it to me to be foolish enough to do that.
So, I mean, say something about that. That's to me is like, it's not maybe not the ultimate comparison, but wow, it's up there. And I think it hasn't. I mean, there's so much media attention now on the UFO or the UAP, but it slices off this aspect of the phenomena in a pretty dramatic way, and you don't slice it off. You pull it in and you say, look, these are clearly, something's going on here. And you use Terence McKenna and Anne Strieber and a bunch of people, Carl Jung, to kind of get at this comparison. But I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Well, for the longest time, I'd never set out to be an anti-ETH sort of person, but when I saw the plurality of
Wait,
ships
you
and
you
creatures,
better define ETH.
sorry, I never set out to be an anti-extraterrestrial hypothesis individual when it comes to the UFO question. However, that was a major stumbling block for me for the longest time to approaching UFOs, is that I would see how many craft there were and how many different races there were. And it sort of seemed to be an actual violation of Occam's razor in that multiplying variables unnecessarily sort of sense. So I could never really get beyond that basic idea, because if you look at the literature, if we're being visited by one literal flesh and blood alien race, we're being visited by like 50 or 100. Like, there's just so many variations throughout the literature. But then when I started understanding this, emerging research on altered states of consciousness, that was sort of my foot in the door. And I did end up taking an anti-extraterrestrial hypothesis stance, not staunchly so, I'm not going to argue someone down, but it was something that sort of stuck with me for a while. And it was one of my go-to things whenever people would talk about, whenever they would equate UFOs and extraterrestrials reflexively, I'd say, okay, but consider this. There are aspects of ecstatic initiation seen in indigenous cultures that quite closely resemble the UFO experience. And, people aboard UFOs see dead relatives. So at the very least, you're dealing with really, really, really strange extraterrestrials. So that had always stuck in my mind, and it was, there's this famous quote from Anne Strieber about collating a lot of the correspondence that's housed at Fondren now, from people who were reading Communion and sharing their experiences. And she had this list of similarities, and Whitley comes in one day and reads them. And one of the ones that stuck with him that he's mentioned in book after book is, this has something to do with what we call death, this being the UFO experience. So there was that tidbit. Part of me had, being a fan of George P. Hansen's work, The Trickster and the Paranormal, he compares a lot of paranormal phenomena, including UFOs, to trickster phenomena. And that includes some of these characters who are psychopomps, who are characters who lead people over the threshold from life to death, such as Hermes. So to me, it felt like maybe there was something was left on the table in that discussion. And the thing that really bugged me the most is that if you look at the comparisons that can be made to the UFO contact experience and fairy folklore, not just of the Western European variety, but anywhere you see little people legends around the world, because it truly is a universal belief, it's so strikingly similar. And I'm not saying that fairies are aliens or aliens are fairies, but I'm saying that these are both cultural dependent descriptions for some sort of ineffable phenomenon that I think has been the same, and it's just we've applied a different mask to it. However, a cornerstone of my work has been Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia, where he sort of illustrates that a lot of these older legends do seem like earlier interpretations of the same UFO phenomena that we're facing today. But again, there's something left on the table in there. The basic, if you really wanted to be reductive, you could say the thesis of Passport to Magonia is, hey, UFOs kind of look like fairies. And of course, Jacques says this a lot more eloquently, right? UFOs kind of look like fairies, but what would a Passport to Magonia pinned in, I don't know, 1400? What would that look like? It probably would say, hey, these fairies look a lot like these dead people. And to that extent, Dr. Simon Young, who is one of my favorite fairy scholars, has pointed out the fact that this sort of idea of fairies as nature elementals is really a post-theosophical invention, and that cultures prior to theosophy, if they thought about fairies at all, typically tended to think of them at the least being associated with, if not direct analogs for, the human dead. So with that transitive property, it sort of blows this whole question into really strange uncharted territory. If you say, well, dead to fairies, fairies to aliens, what does that say about these aliens that we're seeing nowadays? So I thought that I could get in and out in a nice, tidy little 80,000 word book. And that was the stupidest thing that I've ever thought, because what became apparent was that there was so much background information, so much background to cover before we could even start addressing that question. Because a lot of the ways that we think about soulcraft are quite foreign to the modern reader. You know, the idea of polypsychism and the idea of the wandering soul, these are things that are embedded in some of our oldest cultures, but we just don't really give a lot of conscious attention to nowadays. So I was faced with a bit of dilemma. I could either start writing about UFOs from the outset and constantly reference these other concepts, or I could just say, hey, there's a book of primer. And that's not entirely fair, because there's plenty of UFO stuff in volume 1 of Ecology of Souls, but more or less, here's a book of primer talking about near-death experiences, the fairy faith, mountains and monuments, ley lines, death roads, these things that inform the UFO tradition that gets talked about more in volume 2. But that's the other thing that sort of blew up in my face a bit with this project, is the Ecology of Souls carries the very pretentious subtitle, A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal. And I was very hesitant to do that for a while, but speaking with my editor, Barbara Fisher, she's like, no, that really is what it's become, because I found that every aspect that I looked into has been touched upon and is greatly influenced by concepts of the afterlife, concepts of what human spirits do after they die. It just seems to permeate everything, even the cryptozoological field, which is something that not a lot of cryptozoologists like to address. But there's an entire, actually, as a matter of fact, the longest chapter in both books is the chapter on cryptozoology and the links that has to these death traditions as well. And these are links that are sometimes explicit, sometimes they're purely on the the symbolic level, but there's something here, and I don't know if I'm suffering from a sort of willing pareidolia, or if you only have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. But the idea of tying these things always back to death has allowed me to reconcile some things that I always saw as true outliers, topics that I just didn't know what to do with. I mean, a primary example that I like to use is I would collect reports sometimes. One actually comes from my editor, Barbara Fisher, of a UFO turning into a bird. And if you're approaching this from the nuts and bolts angle, you've got to do these hoops of like, well, maybe there was screen memory, or maybe they projected something into your mind, or maybe the UFOs can shapeshift. But then when you take a step back and you adopt, when you adopt some of the ideas of the UFO possibly being an expression of the soul or an exteriorization of the soul, then the idea of it being shapeshifting into a bird makes perfect sense, because the bird soul is one of the true motifs that I would say is absolutely universal. You have people in every indigenous population sort of making that connection, at least in some, somewhere in your region, there is an indigenous culture that has compared the human soul to a bird. So that allows some degree of parsimony there that other models really didn't afford.
So how do we get that message out? I mean, I'm personally so frustrated with the conversation around UAPs in the media and the government. These are threats.
Mm-hmm.
These are machines that are seen on radar by people, and billion-dollar machines designed to shoot down other machines. How do we move from that to a shape-shifting soul that appears as a bird, or dead loved ones appear in an abduction experience, which of course you're absolutely right, Joshua. I mean, I'm a historian of religions by training, and one of the first things I see when I read these abduction accounts is I see spiritual experiences. I see experiences of the soul. I see things I'm very, very familiar with. It's patently obvious to me that these are related. But I don't, I mean, we're up against a lot in the culture to make this comparison. So how do we do that? I know you have your 3 volumes, but I also know nobody reads books.
Right, yeah.
So uh, what do we do with that? I mean, where do we go next?
Well, I have been surprised, quite surprised, in my conversations with, normies, if we're going to be vaguely pejorative, but my friends who aren't into these topics at all, when I talk about UFOs, the number of them that jump in and say, I think they're interdimensional, has been quite striking over the past couple of years, even in light of this sort of constant banging of the ETH drum that we've been enduring. And while I'm skeptical of the strict definition of interdimensional beings or something like that, I prefer to just use the old language and say the other world, right? I think it does signify an openness to more magical thinking in this topic, and a little bit more openness to the idea that these things are not always malicious in intent. At the same time, I'm quite pessimistic about the tenor of the conversation, as you alluded to. It was really interesting to me, even in the brief amount of time that since I first wrote, A Trojan Feast, so it's not even been 10 years yet. I guess it's been 8, man, time flies. But even in that brief amount of time, I felt like I was seeing a lot of traction into discussing UFOs as somehow tied into altered states of consciousness, somehow tied into more metaphysical experiences. And then it was kind of about that time that it's almost, it kind of felt, to be honest with you, a bit like a reaction to that, with this, the Tic Tac footage and everything dropping, almost as sort of a course correction of the narrative. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I think that was sort of the net effect, is that we're back to talking about propulsion systems and anti-gravity and all this stuff, which, may be a legitimate way to look at the phenomenon, but I don't think it's a legitimate way to look at the lion's share of the contact between human beings and what appear to be non-human intelligences. So how do we get the word out? It really is in the hands of the phenomenon. I mean, there's something grassroots, Whitley's talked about this. There's something grassroots and democratic about the way that the phenomenon does tend to approach people. And, I have to look at the current UAP fever as perhaps being a way to fertilize the field so that those individual seeds might be able to grow a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common observation, actually.
I hope.
Maybe we need to do this, make this mistake to realize it's real, and then we can kind of move on to, okay, what do we mean by the real? And
yeah, I mean, that's the thing that, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I just think by definition, I'm so sensitive to this. I think by and sensitive, I mean I'm crabby about this. The soul is unreal. It's not a real thing. It doesn't exist, Joshua. And I'm not saying that because I think that's true. But I think that's what people think. And so to make this comparison is to, I think in the mind somewhere of the person hearing this, is to say, well, none of this is real. If that's the case.
Well, maybe I am a little bit more optimistic than you on this, because I do see sort of an opportunity to get the foot in the door with concepts like this in the magical renaissance, which I do think is alive and thriving. I mean, I'll never forget my astonishment several years ago driving outside of Jacksonville, North Carolina, which is not a metropolis by any stretch of the imagination. We're just driving through the piney woods of eastern North Carolina, and there's a metaphysical, magical, tarot-y, like just a magic shop. in the middle of nowhere, and it's a Wednesday at like 3 p.m, and the parking lot is packed, and I go in and it's packed, and I said, here in rural North Carolina, like, what's going on here? And I do think that magical thinking in that sense is on the rise, for good and for bad, because everything carries with it, negative and positive qualities. But at least that shows an openness to people being aware of how finicky our definitions of real and not real are and can be.
Yeah.
So that's some hope there, I guess.
Yeah. All right, listen, just because questions are coming in pretty quickly, I want to make sure we can voice these questions to you and get your responses to them. Because I really want it to be an open conversation. So let me read a few of these to you, maybe two at a time, and then you can just respond as you see fit. So this one is from Claire Dwyer. Claire writes, in indigenous culture, the 7 grandfather teachings are a pillar, and each of these pillars is represented by a real animal, wolf, eagle, etc., and represents a characteristic like truth, courage, etc. And I was surprised to see that one of those 7 animals is Sabe, which is Bigfoot, and this animal represents honesty. What is the etymology of this word, and why do you think they use it to represent honesty? I think you're muted. You're muted, Josh. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I always try to do that to make sure if I cough or anything. I can't exactly speak to the etymology without doing a little bit of homework specifically. It is interesting to me, as much as I've come around to the idea of Bigfoot being something beyond flesh and blood. It is interesting to see it take its place in a lot of indigenous iconography. For example, on some totem poles where it's presented alongside flesh and blood creatures, right? So that is interesting. As far as why honesty would be specific to Bigfoot, I'm going to be completely honest and not say I have a great answer for that off the top of my head right now.
Okay, well that's
I will say that there is an entire line of discussion that doesn't get addressed enough of indigenous shamanism and how some of these Bigfoot legends do intersect with that.
Yeah.
So it might have something to do with that.
Okay, how about this one? This is Paul Vidal. Do you think our ignorance in the Western world of anomalous phenomena surrounding us puts us in danger somehow? What is the safest way to begin engaging with these subtle realms?
Yeah, I do. This becomes a little bit tricky to navigate because everyone has their own sort of religious leanings. But I think that if you look at some of the more extreme versions of what happens to us after we die, there does seem to be a not a requirement, but an encouragement to prepare for that moment. And I'm talking about things like being able to navigate the bardo, right? Being able to having scouted those lesser lights well enough so that you don't succumb to astonishment at the point of departure and you don't sort of fall over the edge, for lack of a better term. This is something McKenna talked about for a bit. Even more confronting is the idea that you find in Egyptian mythology of your soul being judged, your heart being weighed against a feather, and your soul being judged unworthy and being tossed to Anet, the hippopotamus, crocodile, lion demoness, and just not existing, which I think might be sort of an expression of that same idea of not being able to navigate those afterlife pathways. I mean, it's so striking to me that there are all these traditions sort of death doulaying us past this final most important transition, and we just sort of try to ignore and shove death to the side nowadays. And I think that if we had a little bit more of an awareness of the resources at our disposal to prepare for that moment, it might put us in a better situation when it is our time to go. That's sort of a spiritual danger. As far as a physical danger, maybe an awareness, a lack of awareness of this does place us in less safe waters. I do think that one of the functions of a lot of these phenomena is to re-enchant the natural world. And I suppose that if we had an awareness of, thinking of things like plants as people and rivers like people, our actions that we take environmentally would probably be a lot different as well. So that's a long way of saying yes to your question.
Okay, here's another one from John Martin. What strikes me about Joshua's descriptions of his thinking is that it reminds me not just of comparative religion as a discipline, but also comparative literary methods, close reading, metaphoric and symbolic connections, and analysis of the expressive quality of these experiences. I wonder what role our creative perception, as opposed to our sensory or rational perception, plays in helping us understand the paranormal. Does it reduce their credibility to say that these are creative experiences?
Oh, I don't think so at all. Something that my mentor Greg Bishop has been pounding the drum on a lot is the idea of something about these experiences being co-creative, that we bring a certain amount of baggage to these experiences and sort of graft our own expectations onto them. Or conversely, that these phenomena somehow reach into our heads and access what we want to see. They rifle through the costume wardrobe in your head and say, I think today I'm gonna look like a leprechaun. There we go. Because you do see these stories like that where people are seeing things appropriate to their set and setting and time and place. Of course, I use the term set and setting specifically to sort of reference the possibility of altered states of consciousness and all this. So that is a possible quality. But I also look to these stories of Alan Moore seeing John Constantine and Gibson seeing the shadow, and I think of the extreme power of fiction as well. And we were talking a little bit about this beforehand, but there is that idea that sort of Jungians like to say of people don't have ideas, ideas have people, and I do think that there's something to that. And I think that fiction is perhaps an extension of this phenomena in general. I feel like myths and fiction to a certain degree are metaphorical truths, and my day-to-day life is a literal truth. And I suspect that where those two things meet, where the metaphorical truth and the literal truth meet, is in the numinous encounter, is in the paranormal experience. And it's where those sort of boundaries tend to elide in a way that creates something wholly new that can't be explained.
Yeah, there's a whole, I don't know, there's a whole conference there. There's a whole, well, there are many books there on fiction and the paranormal. I mean, you referenced George Hansen. I'm thinking of that, for example. You also referenced before we got on the air, as it were, that you just finished a novel. Do you want to talk about that process?
Yeah, it was David Metcalf's fault, actually.
Well, everything's David Metcalf.
Everything's David Metcalf's fault.
Let's just agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah, he and I had been talking about it, and I'd gotten tired of not seeing what I wanted to see represented in fiction, and B, seeing the things that I wanted to see done poorly. So I'm not to say that mine will be any better, but I did on Friday complete the first draft, maybe draft 1.5, because I revise every chapter as I go, of a novel that ties in a lot of these different topics that we've been talking about. And it was because I wanted to seek out basically a paranormal experience. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't have a great track record for having these experiences. I've had a couple of ghost kind of things, and I've had some Sasquatch adjacent things happen to me, but in terms of really dramatic experiences, you can fit them inside a thimble. So I said, well, let's sort of call this in a little bit and see if I can experience some of this through the fictional path. And I have been fond of saying things without experiencing it, like, yeah, ideas have people, but it's another thing to be on the cusp of sleep and to have from God knows where, this bolt out of the blue hit you, and like a voice in your head saying exactly what you need to do for this one problem that you've been thinking about all day. And it's thematically resonant and it fits the character, and it just lines up on all these different parameters. And I do realize that once you distract yourself from the task you're trying to solve, sometimes things clear up. I always joke that I write my best stuff between the computer and the fridge, because I'm not thinking about it and it comes to me. But it's been an absolutely uncanny experience. So regardless of whether or not the end product is something where anyone wants to actually consume and read, it was worth it to sort of be on this ride of having characters tell me what they will and won't do, and to have that sort of lived experience come unbidden. It's been really quite interesting. I'm not going to talk about the content, because I read something where Ray Bradbury said, "Don't discuss your writing with anyone, because they're going to make it. They're going to make you change it, even if you don't want to." So, but hopefully it'll be out later this year, and
Well, good.
it's something I would want to read. So,
We'll look forward to that. Mm, I wrote this book called Authors of the Impossible, that actually Archives of the Impossible is named after. And the premise of the book is that, it's that there's something semiotic or literary about paranormal phenomena. They're trying to get our attention. That's why they're so weird and strange. They're trying to tell a story, and we don't always hear this story, but we're being called to tell one. And so this idea of finding oneself inside a story, I think, is the beginning of wisdom, as it were. And
yeah.
people,
Sure, go
well, I
ahead.
was just say, people tell me all the time, that first of all, I'm a spiritual dud, like I heard you say you were. But people tell me all the time, I had this remarkable experience. It was really eerie. I felt like I was in a novel or a movie. And my reply is always, well, that's because you are. I mean, you are in a movie. It's called culture. It's called religion. It's called you. I mean, it's a fiction. Yeah, and the moment you realize that, it's like this eerie kind of, the world starts to go like this, and then you can retell that story and kind of change your life, as it were, in a pretty dramatic way.
No, I completely agree. This is, I would, I kind of want to say this, and I kind of don't want to say this because I'm watching the clock here. But in 2020, I checked myself into rehab for alcoholism, and it was the most amazing transformative experience. And not because I was in some sort of pink cloud of having found some sort of new spirituality. What I mean by that is that I really tried to sort of immerse myself in sort of the Campbellian stuff and the Jungian stuff, and just sort of trying to look at everything through the archetypal lens. And it provided such an incredible amount of guidance for sort of that belly of the whale moment in my life. But on a more objective level, I have never had so many synchronicities pop up in my life in so many astonishing ways. Quick thumbnail sketch of one of them. I often worry about how much software I need to upload to my sons because they just turned 4. So for one day, for some reason, I became completely fixated on Aesop's fables and wondering how did I learn Aesop's fables? Where are they going to learn Aesop's fables? I've got to put Aesop's fables in their brain. And I just obsessed over this because I am diagnosed obsessive compulsive. And I obsessed about it all day. I get home, I'm walking them in the baby stroller, thinking about Aesop's fables. I get home, my foot crosses the threshold. I get a call on the phone from my mother. She says, "Hey, we're at that bookshop at the beach, and I just picked up something for the boys that I think they'll really like. It's Aesop's fables." And it was just stuff like that every dadgum day. And I think that, being able to sort of situate that into that time of my life, that sort of death and rebirth and rebuilding sort of arc, helped me make a lot more sense of it and sort of use it to the fullest. Now, interestingly enough, the farther I get away from that time period, the more that those synchronicities have tapered off in a pretty amazing way, but or pretty dramatic way. But yeah, for a while there, it was just that sort of thing every dadgum day.
Okay, well, so you're not a spiritual dad, Joshua.
No, I guess I just got to keep on kicking my own tail and, and going back to the bottom of the pit. Yeah.
All right. Hey, listen, let me ask two questions at once here because we are getting close. One is from Saw Nelson and the other is from Douglas Batchelor. I'm going to ask them both, and then you can respond as you see fit. Saw writes, what can you say about supernatural or paranormal experiences that people have with birds that aren't clearly correlated to ufological phenomena? Do you think that birds might become natural carriers of souls that come from the other world? Okay. Now hold on, hold
Okay.
off. You can think about that one. Um, Douglas Batchelor writes, I had Dr. Kripal on my podcast at the beginning of the year and asked him whether he thought that certain government organizations knew more about the UFO phenomena than we do. Dr. Jeff, okay, that's a nice name. Dr. Jeff said they were as clueless as we are. I probably used more colorful language. What does Josh think about this? Okay, there's your two questions.
Okay. So the first question, um, yeah, yes, the bird is just such a potent symbol. It's a near universal psychopomp. As I said, it is a universal symbol for the human soul. It's also a profound death omen. I don't know, Dr. Kripal, if you're familiar with the work of Claude Lecouteux.
Yeah, I am.
He writes my favorite UFO books. I tell people, even though he's never written a UFO book, because he does all this old medievalist. Uh,
He's French. He's a French kind of
yes, yeah,
historian of old Europe, right? I mean,
yeah,
he
and you
writes
read
really
it.
weird books too, by the way. Like,
Yeah, and yeah, he does, and you read his work, and you can tell that he thinks that this is not all just a bunch of misinformed superstition. Like
yeah.
he grants some reality to these things, but he provides an exhaustive list of some of these bird superstitions. So there does seem to be some sort of connection there. It's very much tied into this idea of things like migration, birds being able to travel distances that human beings can't comprehend. You've got these older traditions, especially in the Middle East, of the language of the birds having some sort of encoded wisdom. So birds are just strange in general. And the fact that they do seem to show up in conjunction with the UFO phenomena, not the least of which is all the owl symbolism that my friend Mike Clellan has chronicled. Does seem to suggest that maybe you should give those birds some side eye next time you see them. But yeah, birds are one of them. I would say birds are one of the most profoundly symbolic and deeply connected to the paranormal animal that there is, natural animal that there is. Now, as to Douglas's question, hi Douglas.
Let me
Oh,
push on
sure.
Saul's question a little, because
Sure.
I think what they were asking was, do natural birds, like physical birds, can they act as vehicles or expressions of someone who has just died? I think that's what they were asking.
Yeah, if I memory recalls, I mean, that was one of the things that Peter Fenwick noticed in his NDE research, is that there were these massive amounts of birds that would show up after people died away. So there is a body, an entire, pardon the pun, wing of NDE research that focuses on that connection as well. So yeah, I think that now, of course, the question is where you make the cut between living birds and something more mysterious. And if you sort of end up looking at things through this reincarnative, interconnected, almost monist lens, then you really don't have to distinguish between a real bird and a bird that is your dead grandmother or whatever, because they can be one and the same. They don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Okay, how about this second question? Do they know more than we do, or are they clueless?
Well, I have something that I say in Ecology Volume 2, which is, which would more profoundly impact your day-to-day life? That reality looks like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or that reality looks like the Odyssey? Like, which is which is stranger, right? So which would have more of an impact? Which would you guard more closely if you were an authority structure? So I tend to think that there's a better data set available to these authority structures, and I tend to think that it baffles them even more. In my most optimistic days, I feel like that data set reveals to the authority structures that we are indeed immortal beings, each one of us, and that they are terrified of that being confirmed, because every authority structure is predicated on, at the end of the day, state sanctioned violence. Like, any transgression can be met with violence. And if you are an immortal soul, then that one bit of power that they have over you sort of vanishes. Like, yeah, I can refuse to pay parking tickets and you can throw me in jail, but this is just one of my, one of several lives that I have. Or you can execute me, but it's just one of several lives that I have. So that's my more optimistic interpretation. So that's sort of a staggered series of things that I tend to think about that question.
So it's kind of both, if what I'm hearing. The data set's probably better, but there's still clues.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think most of the time.
Okay, that's what you think on Monday, Wednesdays, and Friday.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe not Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yeah.
All right, let's give the last question to our mutual friend Greg Bishop, who I think has a really interesting question here that is relevant to a lot of our lives. Greg asks, do you think that some current media representations of the paranormal may be helping with this reenchantment of our culture that you spoke of? And Greg is talking about, he's not talking about media as in newspapers. He's talking about, film, cinematic portrayals, stream services or series, these kinds of things. So I'll stop there. I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, I do to a certain degree. I do find it frustrating whenever there's a magical element in one of these movies or books, and the answer is aliens, because I'm like, well, it's just a new explanation for something that would have been attributed to spirits or fae folk. It's a real sleight of hand to make it sound more authentic or more, believable or realistic than it actually is. But I have noticed a trend towards looking at these things from a more symbolic, open-ended sort of way. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a bit here with Greg, but one of my favorite bits of UFO media is actually season 2 of the FX television series Fargo, of all things. I know, right? But there's a way that particular season of the show shows the UFO as just another aspect of life. It's almost like the wind or the trees, but it also does have sort of a very Ecology of Souls ending in the season finale. Really comes out of left field. I know people wouldn't associate Fargo with being one of the best supernatural shows, but it really does show how these aren't necessarily always, yes, they're life-changing, but they aren't always the focal point of people's experiences. They are a part of they're part of a birthright of being human. It's just something that you come into contact with over the course of a life. So that's one example off the top of my head. I'm sure I'm not thinking of 1,000 others that I think you do an even better job, but that's one of them. Yeah.
But do you think, I mean, just to push Greg's point, and then we'll close, do you think that these films and television series are helping us, or do you think they're not? They're unhelping us.
I keep coming back to my conversations with musicians. I mean, I can think of several interactions that I've had, and there are, I mean, not like this is the anti-ETH show, right? But like, I have had several conversations with folks, and they've said interdimensional. They've said, I remember a conversation at 2 a.m. with a band member who decided to broach the topic of UFOs, and she looks at the other guy and says, what you really need to understand is it's all about consciousness. And I was like, what are you saying? Another conversation where I brought, somebody wanted to talk to me about UFOs, and I said, I think that this has something to do with these more ancient modalities that we would call shamanic. And he goes, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. So maybe I'm just hanging out with weirdo musicians, or I think that the temperature in the room is changing. I'm not sure which. So I'm gonna choose to be optimistic about this topic.
Okay, that's actually a really good place to stop. The temperature in the room is changing. I hope it's not getting too hot. I hope it's getting comfortable. So Joshua, listen, thank you. Thank you for talking and sharing so much of yourself. And we're going to see you in what, 7 days, 1 week?
Yeah, a week can change. Yep.
8 days, whatever that is. So thank you, Joshua Cutchin. Thank you all for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you in Houston next week.
Thank you so much.